Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Once again, I am Ma'am Dea, and for today, we will be discussing Module 2 of Grade 10 Science, which is entitled Feedback Mechanisms in Female Reproductive System. So in your screen, you can see here the title I used in my presentation is the menstrual cycle, because we will be starting with this concept and then relate this to the different feedback mechanisms that is happening in our body, in particular, positive and negative feedback mechanisms. Now, what is the learning competency that we want to tackle for this video lesson? So what we want to do is describe the feedback mechanisms involved in regulating processes in the female reproductive system. The code is provided on your screens. So let's have a short review of the female reproductive system. This was already discussed in last week's lesson. So if you haven't watched my video about this, you can watch it as provided in the link above. So this picture was taken from the module that was provided to us by the Division of Caloocan City. Last time, in our discussion, we gave the different functions of the different parts of the female reproductive system, particularly highlighting the internal parts. We have the fallopian tube, the ovary, the uterus, the cervix, and the vagina. I hope you can still remember what are the functions of each of these parts. Now for this lesson, we need to first define some important terms. What are these important terms? First, we have menstruation. A while ago, I showed you the title of this lesson, which is about menstrual cycle. However, take note that menstruation and menstrual cycle are not the same. Menstruation is defined to be the process in which blood and other tissues are shed from the uterus and leave the body through the vagina. So sa ating mga babae, ang tawag natin dito sa Tagalog, ito yung times na tayo ay nagkakaroon, and it happens normally once a month or every 28 days. We also have this term menarche, which is the start of menstruation. This is the first menstruation that girls have, and usually this happens between ages 11 to 15. Okay, can you still remember when was your first menstruation? We call that menarche. And then, pag tayo ay tumatanda na, we also have what we call menopause or menopausal period. During menopausal period, your ovaries can no longer produce egg cells. Therefore, if there are no egg cells, fertilization is not possible. And this normally occurs during the ages 45 and 55. Just like what I have said a while ago, the ovary releases an egg every 28 days. Although sabi natin, normally nagkakaroon ang isang babae buwan-buwan, hindi talaga ito saktong buwan-buwan. So, if ever na nagkaroon ng isang babae ng March 15, sa April, magkakaroon siya dapat ng earlier than April 15. Yun yung normal. Pero, alam naman natin na hindi lahat ng babae ay normal ang kanilang menstrual cycle. So here I'm showing a summary of the menstrual cycle. As we can see on the screen, we have 4 phases. And since it's a cycle, we cannot really start at one point kasi umiikot yan. Pagkatapos ng isang phase, hindi siya matitigil doon, uulit siya, mag-i-start na naman sa simula. So, we can start with menstruation, then followed by follicular phase, and then ovulation, and finally the luteal phase. After the luteal phase, babalik na naman tayo sa menstruation and the cycle goes on. More information in the next slides. Okay, again, a menstrual cycle normally, the span of time is 28 days. And the first phase would be the flow phase or the menstruation phase. Remember the key term there, okay, flow. Ito yung panahon kung kailan tayo nagkakaroon, may lumalabas sa dugo sa ating vagina. On the right part of your screen, you can see a lot of images here, pero I will be explaining what happens in each part of the image. Kasi in the first part, this shows a graph of the two hormones, LH and FSH, that we have discussed last week. Again, LH stands for luteinizing hormone, and then FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. On the next part of the screen, you can see the ovarian cycle. Here we can see how an ovum or an egg cell develops starting from a follicle and then disintegrates into what we call a corpus luteum. We will be discussing that further later. And then on the third part, we have here levels of hormones produced by the ovary, and these two hormones, as discussed last week, are estrogen and progesterone. Finally, on the bottom part of the graph or of the picture, you can see changes in the endometrium. So makita natin dyan kung kailan siya kumakapal, kailan siya nagdi-disintegrate, tapos kung anong phase nangyayari yung mga changes na yon. So let's go now to the flow phase. Flow phase happens during days 1 to 5. Days 1 to 5 does not necessarily pertain to the 1st to the 5th day of the month. Again, I'm not referring to the actual date. Let's say April 1 to April 5. Hindi ganon. Flow phase, the number of days indicated here depends on the cycle that is unique to a female. For example, female A starts her menstruation today, which is March 29. So that means that day 2 would be March 30, day 3 would be March 31, and so on and so forth. However, female B would have a different cycle. So halimbawa, yung isang babae, ang start naman ng menstruation niya, April 5, so yun yung day 1 niya. Magbibilang ng magbibilang. So what I want to emphasize here is that days 1 to 5 or whatever days that you will be encountering later, they are dependent on the cycle of a female. Now what happens during flow phase? During this phase, flow phase or menstruation phase, endometrium is shed. Okay? It's understandable because may dugong lumalabas sa atin that is coming from the endometrium. That is the endometrium being shed out of a girl's or a female's body. Also, during this time, the follicle starts to grow in the ovary. Okay, so you can see here in the picture that there is a small circle that is gradually increasing over time. This is the follicle. Yung follicle, dyan sa loob niyan, nabubuo yung egg cell. During this time also, estrogen and progesterone levels are low. You can see that on the graph. So there we have box flow phase. Ayan ang pinapakita niya. Again, flow phase or menstruation, this is the time when menstrual fluid comes out of our vagina. After the flow phase or menstruation phase, we have what we call the follicular phase. According to one source, this happens from days 6 to 13. However, in some books, they say that follicular phase also coincides with menstruation phase or the flow phase, which is days 1 to 13. However, in this PowerPoint, we will be adapting days 6 to 13 para may continuity. So during this time, follicles grow and mature. It is very evident in the picture on the right that the follicles start to grow in size. And then, estrogen is secreted. So, tapos na si, diba? Si flow phase. Na-shred na si endometrium. During this time, follicular phase, nag-i-start na namang kumapal si endometrium. And LH is being stimulated, or the luteinizing hormone is being stimulated by the pituitary gland. This part of the graph is the follicular phase. And here on the left side, I have a picture showing the follicle and the egg cell or the ovum inside it. So this is around 1 week. After follicular phase, we have a 1-day event, which is what we call ovulation. Okay, ovulation is actually the most important day for expecting families. Bakit? Because the egg cell bursts from the follicle and goes to the oviduct or the fallopian tube. So this means that during this day 14, this is the only time that is very sure that pregnancy is possible. Okay? Kasi si egg cell, bababa siya sa fallopian tube, mag-aantay na siya ng sperm cell. At 1 day lang yan. During this time, LH levels are very high. And sabi nga natin, the egg cell bursts out from the follicle, is caught by the fimbriae, and waits in the fallopian tube or the oviduct. Again, this only happens in 1 day. After ovulation, okay, this would be 2 weeks. Ito yung pinakamatagal sa lahat, luteal phase. So what happens in luteal phase? The luteinizing hormone causes corpus luteum to develop from a follicle. So anong mangyayari kay follicle na iniwanan na ni egg cell? Si egg cell lalabas or magbo-burst from the follicle. Si follicle, ang mangyayari sa kanya, it will transform into what we call a corpus luteum. Okay, the corpus luteum is the part of the ovary that secretes estrogen and progesterone. Due to the high level of progesterone, what happens is that this thickened endometrium is being maintained para maiwasan yung mga tinatawag natin na contractions. However, during this time, take note that LH or the luteinizing hormone and FSH or the follicle stimulating hormone are being inhibited. Ibig sabihin, bababa rin yung kanilang levels. Mataas si estrogen and progesterone pero mababa si LH at saka si FSH. After this, diba, during this time, masyado nang makapal si endometrium, babalik na naman sa tinatawag natin na flow phase or menstruation phase. Magkakaroon na naman ng shredding of the endometrium. However, there will be a different case if the egg is fertilized. Syempre, if the egg is fertilized, hindi mo na pupunta sa flow phase kasi the egg cell, the fertilized egg cell, will implant itself in the endometrium. Well, to summarize, I have here a picture of an ovary where you can see the illustration of a follicle and a corpus luteum. So on the bottom part, you have here the follicles with the egg cells on them. You start with very small follicles and then eventually, as it nourishes the egg cell, it also becomes larger until such time that the egg cell or the ovum comes out of that follicle. Tapos, yung naiwan na follicle na wala ng egg cell, that becomes a corpus luteum. An empty follicle transforms into a corpus luteum. Okay? So, again, let's have a recap of the 4 phases of the menstrual cycle. In our discussion, we started with menstruation or the flow phase. So, during this time, the endometrium is being shed into what we call the menstrual fluid or the blood that comes out of our body. And then after that, we have the follicular phase. During this time, the follicles start to mature with the egg cell. And then, after that, we have a 1-day event called the ovulation. During this time, the ovum or the egg cell bursts out of the follicle. And finally, we have the luteal phase in which the endometrium becomes thick enough to prepare itself to support pregnancy kung if ever the egg cell is fertilized. However, if not, okay, babalik tayo sa menstrual phase or menstruation phase or flow phase. Again, I want to emphasize this is a cycle. So as long as fertilization does not occur, tuloy-tuloy lang po na iikot yan. Okay? Let's go now to hormones. A while ago, I told you that the title of this lesson is Feedback Mechanisms in Female Reproductive System. So also, last week, we have discussed that whatever happens in the female and male reproductive system, this is in close coordination with the master gland, which is the pituitary gland. However, for this lesson, we will be focusing on the female reproductive system. Now, let's have a short review of the hormones. Here we will be including one more hormone. We have the GnRH or the gonadotropin releasing hormone. Now, what is the function of GnRH? So, the GnRH is a hormone that comes from the hypothalamus. As you can see in the picture on the screen, the pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus. So the GnRH is needed in order to release the LH and the FSH in the pituitary gland. So without the GnRH, wala si LH at saka si FSH. So FSH, again, it stands for follicle stimulating hormone. LH stands for luteinizing hormone. And then, remember, FSH and LH are released by the pituitary gland. And then, we also have estrogen and progesterone which are released by the ovaries. Now, saan ba papasok yung tinatawag natin na feedback mechanisms? Ano ba yung positive at saka negative feedback mechanisms na meron sa module ninyo? So, when we say feedback mechanism, this is a process through which the level of one substance, particularly the hormones, okay, influences the level of another substance. This is very important for us to maintain homeostasis. Sabi nga natin last time, homeostasis, equilibrium, balance, they are all synonymous with each other. So, ano ba yung positive at saka negative feedback mechanism? Tatandaan lang natin, when we say positive feedback mechanism, this is something that stimulates the increase of a hormone. Increase of the levels of a hormone. Now, when we say negative feedback mechanism, this inhibits or decreases or stops the production of a certain hormone. So for example, in the picture that is shown to you on your screen, this was taken from the module that you have. An example of a positive feedback mechanism which is related to the female reproductive system is the one that happens before ovulation. So prior to ovulation, okay, this is the follicular phase. The hormone estrogen stimulates the production of GnRH or the gonadotropin releasing hormone and the LH or the luteinizing hormone. Ibig sabihin, the presence of estrogen, when it is released by the ovaries, it signals the increase in these hormones. On the other hand, for the negative feedback mechanism, after ovulation, remember, the follicle becomes corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum releases progesterone. Progesterone particularly inhibits the production of both GnRH and LH. So when we say inhibits, pinapababa niya yung level ng GnRH and LH. So that is the difference between a positive feedback mechanism and the negative feedback mechanism. So that's all for today's discussion. It is shorter than last week because the focus for now is just the menstrual cycle. So I hope somehow I have given you enough information about this lesson. If you have questions, don't hesitate to post them on the comment section below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching and see you next lesson. Bye!